Chapter 1. A Clear Blue Morning. If you were alive that morning, you probably remember where you were. Maybe not every detail, maybe not every minute, but something about that day stays fixed in the mind. The color of the sky, the sound of the news, the feeling that the world had turned suddenly strange. On the morning of September 11th, 2001, the sky over New York was bright and clean. It looked like a perfect morning, the kind of morning that makes people move a little faster because the day seems full of promise. People walked into offices with coffee in their hands. They checked their watches. They answered phones. They opened computers. They talked about meetings, traffic, breakfast, and the normal small problems of an ordinary Tuesday. In Washington, D.C., people moved through another workday. In homes across the United States, parents had already kissed their children goodbye. Some children were in school, some were still getting ready. Some people were on airplanes, thinking about business trips, family visits, or the next city on their schedule. Everything felt ordinary, and that is what makes the memory so painful. Evil did not arrive in the middle of chaos. It arrived in the middle of routine. Almost no one knew that history was about to break in half. Then, at 8:46 in the morning, American Airlines Flight 11 crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center. For a few moments, many people thought it must be an accident. The building was burning, smoke was rising, news cameras turned toward Lower Manhattan. People stared upward, confused. Then, at 9:03, United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. Now there was no accident. Now there was terror. Now the whole world understood that it was watching an attack in real time. A third plane hit the Pentagon at 9:37. A fourth crashed in Pennsylvania at 10:03 after passengers fought back. And in less than 2 hours, thousands of lives were gone. The towers collapsed. Smoke rolled through New York. Ash covered the streets. Sirens screamed through the city. Televisions around the world showed the same impossible pictures again and again. People ran through gray dust. People called names into smoke. People looked at the skyline and saw absence where certainty had once stood. Time itself seemed to change. For millions of people, life became divided into two parts: before September 11th and after September 11th. Very quickly, one name moved into the center of the story: Osama bin Laden. But names can hide as much as they reveal. Behind that name was a life, a set of ideas, a network, and a long chain of decisions that led toward mass murder. But who was he really? He did not come from poverty. He did not come from obscurity. He was not a lonely madman acting alone. He was a wealthy Saudi man who became the leader of a violent extremist network, a man who believed that murder on a massive scale could change history. This is not a story of dark greatness. It is not a story of a hero. It is the story of how a man with money, influence, and purpose turned himself into the face of global terror, and how that choice pulled much of the world into grief, fear, and war. To understand September 11th, we have to understand the man behind it. But we must also remember something else. The center of this story is not only the attacker. The center is also the people whose lives were stolen. The office workers, the flight attendants, the restaurant staff, the firefighters, the police officers, the janitors, the passengers, the mothers and fathers. the sons and daughters. So we begin there, on a clear blue morning, when ordinary life was suddenly cut open by extraordinary violence. And to understand how that morning became possible, we have to go back, far away from New York, to the wealthy world in which Osama bin Laden began his life.
Chapter 2: A Son of Wealth. Osama bin Muhammad bin Awad bin Laden was born in Saudi Arabia in 1957. He entered life from a place of privilege. His father, Mohammed bin Laden, was one of the most successful construction businessmen in the kingdom. He built roads, mosques, and major projects for the Saudi royal family. The family name carried money, status, and influence. It opened doors. Osama was one of many children in a very large family. In such a family, not every child becomes the center of attention, but he still grew up in comfort. He had security. He had education. He had a respected family name. This matters, because when people later tried to explain his life, it was tempting to imagine a poor boy pushed toward violence by desperation. That was not his story. He was not born powerless. He was not born forgotten. He had choices. People who knew him in his younger years often described him as quiet, serious, and deeply religious. He did not seem wild. He did not seem theatrical. He did not appear to be chasing pleasure in the way some rich young men do. He presented himself with discipline. Even early on, there was something stern about him. But seriousness alone does not explain extremism. Many people are religious. Many people are disciplined. Many people search for meaning. Very few become leaders of violent organizations. To understand his path, we need to look at the world around him. Saudi Arabia in the 1960s and 1970s was deeply shaped by religion, monarchy, and oil wealth. It was also tied closely to world power politics. The Middle East was full of struggle, change, and argument. Some people wanted secular nationalism. Some wanted stronger monarchy. Some wanted Islamic revival. Some saw foreign powers as protectors. Others saw them as humiliating intruders. A young man growing up in that world could easily absorb a powerful sense of civilizational struggle, and Osama bin Laden did. As he grew older and studied in Jeddah, he came into contact with religious and political ideas that helped shape him. Some thinkers argued that the Muslim world had become weak because it had drifted from true faith. Others argued that foreign powers had invaded Muslim lands, supported corrupt rulers, and stolen dignity from believers. Some of these ideas were nonviolent, some were not. For a young man already drawn to seriousness, purity, and duty, these ideas offered a simple map of the world. A dangerous map. They turned complicated political history into a story of believers and enemies, purity and corruption, honor and humiliation. And simple stories can be very powerful, especially when they promise meaning. Osama bin Laden wanted more than a rich life. He wanted purpose. He wanted to feel part of something larger than himself. And in 1979, history gave him the cause that would change his life more than any other: the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. That war would give him more than a battlefield. It would give him identity, myth, and the first real sense that history had chosen him for something larger. Chapter 3: The War That Made Him.
When Soviet forces entered Afghanistan in 1979, The conflict quickly became larger than one country. Across the Muslim world, many people saw the invasion as an attack on a Muslim population by a foreign superpower. Money started moving, volunteers started traveling, clerics preached about duty, activists raised support. Governments, intelligence services, charities, and private donors all entered the picture in different ways. The war became both local and international, and Osama bin Laden was drawn into it. At first, he was not famous as a battlefield commander. His value was different. He had money. He had family connections. He could help move supplies, raise funds, build camps, and create support networks. He was useful because he could organize. That may sound less dramatic than combat, but in long wars, logistics can matter as much as weapons. Roads matter, trucks matter, money matters, safe houses matter, loyal contacts matter. Bin Laden learned that a network can be as powerful as a gun. In Afghanistan and nearby Pakistan, he also found something else. He found identity. He found brotherhood. He found a theater in which he could imagine himself as part of world history. This emotional change was crucial. Some people go to war and come away horrified by violence. Others come away believing that violence revealed their true purpose. Bin Laden moved toward the second path. The Afghan War offered him more than a mission. It offered him a myth. As the 1980s continued, the Soviet Union paid a heavy price in Afghanistan. Afghans paid far more. Villages were destroyed, families were displaced, cities were scarred. Yet for foreign volunteers like bin Laden, the war created a seductive lesson. When Soviet forces eventually withdrew, bin Laden and many men around him interpreted that result in the simplest possible way. They believed devoted believers had helped defeat a superpower. That was not the full truth. The Soviet withdrawal had many causes, including Afghan resistance, outside support, military cost, and serious internal weakness inside the Soviet system. But myths do not need full truth to become powerful. Bin Laden took from Afghanistan a very dangerous conclusion. If one superpower could be bloodied and pushed back, maybe another could too. That idea stayed with him, and it changed everything. Because once a man believes that history has already given him proof, he becomes harder to stop. He stops seeing caution as wisdom. He starts seeing caution as weakness. The Afghan War also connected him to a new world of militants from many countries. These men shared stories, loyalties, contacts, and ambitions. They were no longer only fighting one war. Some of them were beginning to imagine a wider future, a transnational struggle that could continue after Afghanistan. Bin Laden was one of those men. He no longer wanted only to support a battlefield. He wanted to build something that would survive the battlefield, something that could move across borders, something that could turn anger into structure. That structure would soon have a name: al-Qaeda. Chapter 4: Building the Base. Al-Qaeda began to take shape near the end of the 1980s. The name is often translated as the base. That word matters. A base is a starting point, a foundation, a place from which future action can grow. Bin Laden and his allies were thinking beyond one war. They wanted a lasting system. Al-Qaeda was not designed like a normal army. It did not need borders, uniforms, or a capital city. It needed camps, money, training, secrecy, documents, contacts, and loyalty. It was a network before it was anything else. That made it flexible and dangerous. A network can hide. A network can spread. A network can lose one node and keep moving through another. Bin Laden was not the only important figure in its formation. Other militants, including Ayman al-Zawahiri and other organizers, helped shape the group and its ideology. But bin Laden became one of its central symbols. He had wealth. He had the story of Afghanistan behind him. He had the image of a man who had walked away from comfort for a holy cause. For some people, that image had power. Extremist movements rarely sell only violence. They sell belonging. They sell certainty. They sell purpose. They promise followers that they are not small men with confused lives, but chosen men standing inside a great historical struggle. Bin Laden understood this. He understood the emotional side of extremism. He also understood presentation. He often spoke in a calm, controlled way. He did not need to shout. Soft voices can sometimes carry dangerous ideas more effectively than loud ones. In his message, the Muslim world was under attack from foreign powers and betrayed by weak or corrupt rulers at home. Therefore, he argued, violence was not simply permitted, it was necessary. This is where his path became especially deadly, because he took real political grievances, wars, occupation, corruption, foreign intervention, humiliation, and folded them into an ideology that justified murder. Most Muslims rejected that ideology. That point must be clear. Bin Laden did not represent ordinary Muslim life. He did not speak for the daily faith of families, workers, students, teachers, and neighbors across the world. He represented a radical and violent movement that turned religion into a weapon. Still, extremist groups do not need millions of followers to become deadly. They need secrecy. They need discipline. They need planning. And they need leaders who can convince a small number of people that mass violence is morally meaningful. By the early 1990s, bin Laden was moving toward open conflict with the United States. But one more event would push him there with even greater force: the Gulf War. Chapter 5: Betrayal and Exile. By now, bin Laden had a network, a reputation, and a worldview. What he still needed was an enemy large enough to define the rest of his life. When Iraq invaded Kuwait in 1990, Saudi Arabia feared the conflict could spread into the kingdom. The Saudi government allowed American troops to enter Saudi territory to help defend it. For the Saudi rulers, this was strategy. For Osama bin Laden, it was betrayal. He was furious that foreign, non-Muslim troops were now stationed on land connected to Islam's holiest cities. He believed the rulers of Saudi Arabia had surrendered dignity for protection. He reportedly offered his own fighters as an alternative, but the Saudi government did not accept him as a serious answer. That rejection mattered. It made his anger personal. It deepened his hostility toward both the Saudi state and the United States. After this, his relationship with Saudi authorities broke down further. His criticism grew louder. His political imagination grew more extreme. He began to present the presence of American power in the Arabian Peninsula as part of a larger war against Islam. Again, the pattern was clear. Take a real political event, strip away complexity, turn it into a sacred moral drama, then use that drama to justify violence. Bin Laden spent increasing time outside Saudi Arabia, and eventually he moved to Sudan. During the 1990s, Sudan gave him room to expand his business interests and militant ties. He invested in roads, farms, and construction. He built connections across borders. He developed relationships with other extremists.
This period is important because it shows that terrorism is not built only in caves or on battlefields. It is also built in offices, in finances, in transport systems, in personal trust, in patient organization. Bin Laden was not simply angry, he was building, and he was building for the long term. His public statements against the United States also became more direct in these years. He spoke about U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia. He spoke about the suffering of Iraqis. He spoke about American support for Israel. In his rhetoric, these different issues became pieces of one total picture, a picture of humiliation, aggression, and necessary revenge. This was one of his most dangerous skills. He could gather separate grievances and tie them into one emotional knot. Then he could offer violence as the knife that would cut it. In 1996, under international pressure, Sudan expelled him. He returned to Afghanistan. That return would prove critical. Afghanistan was unstable, the Taliban were rising, and bin Laden needed what every underground militant leader needs most: sanctuary. The Taliban and al-Qaeda were not the same organization, but they formed a mutually useful relationship. The Taliban offered a place to live and operate. Al-Qaeda brought money, fighters, and transnational connections. Now bin Laden had space again, space to train, space to plan, space to recruit, space to dream bigger. And soon, the world would begin to see what that meant.
Chapter 6: Warnings Before the Storm. Before September 11th, there were earlier attacks that revealed al-Qaeda's intentions. The danger did not appear in one sudden flash. It grew. In 1998, truck bombs exploded at U.S. embassy buildings in Kenya and Tanzania. More than 200 people were killed and thousands were injured. Many of the dead were African civilians. That detail matters deeply because it reminds us that al-Qaeda did not target only symbols of American power. It was willing to kill ordinary people on a large scale. Then, in 2000, the USS Cole, an American naval ship in Yemen, was attacked. 17 American sailors were killed. These attacks showed a pattern. Al-Qaeda could wait. It could plan across borders. It could choose symbolic targets. It could turn surprise into spectacle. It could kill, then use the killing as propaganda. American officials were watching bin Laden more closely by this time. Intelligence agencies had warnings, fragments, clues, and prior cases. But organizations like al-Qaeda are difficult to stop. They use couriers, they divide tasks, they spread knowledge across many people so that no one person always sees the whole picture. This is part of what makes modern terrorism so dangerous. It does not need a large army moving openly. It needs a hidden system, a flexible system, a patient system. Bin Laden wanted something larger than the attacks that had already happened. He wanted a strike that would shock the world in a way no one could ignore. He wanted to hurt the United States physically, emotionally, economically, and psychologically all at once. He also wanted provocation. He believed that a spectacular attack could pull the United States into long wars, and that long wars could weaken a superpower over time, just as he believed the Soviet Union had once been weakened in Afghanistan. This idea sat at the center of his thinking. Terrorism for him was not only about immediate death and destruction, it was also about reaction. How the enemy would feel, how the enemy would respond, how history could be pushed off balance. Within al-Qaeda, a plan began to grow.
Other figures, especially Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, played major roles in developing it, but bin Laden was central to the project. He approved it, he supported it, and he understood its symbolic power. The basic concept was almost unbelievably simple. Turn passenger planes into weapons. Use the openness of modern life against itself. Use air travel, trust, routine, and surprise to create a spectacle of mass murder. The men chosen for the plot had to do something cold and difficult. They had to live quietly inside the United States while preparing for violence on historic scale. Some learned to fly, some managed money, some studied routines, some tried to appear normal. That is one of the hardest truths in stories like this. Great violence is not always loud before it happens. Sometimes it grows quietly beneath daily life. By the summer of 2001, the plot was moving toward its final stage. The world still did not understand how close it was to disaster.
Chapter 7. The Day of the Attacks. Tuesday, September 11, 2001, began like any other weekday. That ordinary beginning is part of what made the shock so deep. Nothing in the weather warned anyone. Nothing in the skyline warned anyone. Nothing in the voice of a parent leaving home warned anyone. And then the attacks began. At 8:46, Flight 11 struck the North Tower. At 9:03, Flight 175 struck the South Tower. At 9:37, Flight 77 hit the Pentagon. At 10:03, Flight 93 crashed in Pennsylvania after passengers fought back against the hijackers. Inside the Twin Towers, people tried to understand what was happening while smoke, fire, and confusion spread through the buildings. Some moved downward through stairwells, some were trapped. Some made phone calls to spouses, parents, children, and friends. Some waited for instructions that would never arrive. Some searched for any possible path to survive. Outside, people watched in horror. Firefighters and police officers rushed toward danger while others ran away from it. They entered buildings that were already burning. They climbed stairs carrying heavy equipment. They kept moving upward even while the scale of the disaster was still unclear. Many of them would never come home. The fourth plane told another story. Passengers on Flight 93 learned about the earlier attacks through phone calls. They understood what was happening. They understood that their plane was likely part of the same plot. So they made a decision. Instead of waiting helplessly, they fought. Everyone on the plane died, but they stopped the aircraft from reaching its intended target. That courage has remained part of the moral memory of the day. Then came the collapses. At 9:59, the South Tower fell. At 10:28, the North Tower fell. For millions of people watching on television, the images looked unreal. Steel, dust, glass, paper, smoke, and fear filled the air over Lower Manhattan. People ran through ash-covered streets. Sirens seemed endless. News anchors struggled to describe what their own eyes could barely accept. By the end of the day, 2,977 victims had been killed in the attacks, not including the hijackers. The dead came from many countries, many faiths, and many walks of life. Some were famous, most were not. Some worked on high floors, some worked in kitchens, some were cleaning offices before going home, some were meeting clients, some were simply passengers flying to another city. This matters because terrorism tries to make human beings disappear into symbolism. It turns people into numbers, targets, messages, or collateral damage. But the dead of September 11th were not symbols. They were people, and that human truth must never be pushed to the side. Chapter 8. Why bin Laden wanted this. After the attacks, one question rose above all others. Why? Why would someone plan something like this? Why would a man born into wealth and safety dedicate himself to the murder of strangers? The answer is not one sentence, but part of it is clear. Bin Laden believed that dramatic violence could change history. He believed that a superpower could be wounded through spectacle and fear. He believed the American economy could be shaken. He believed the attacks would raise his prestige among extremists, and above all, he believed they would draw the United States into a larger and longer confrontation. He wanted a historic clash. He wanted to make himself the man who had struck America at its core. This is one of the central truths about terrorism. It is not only about killing, it is also about theater, about symbols, about memory, about fear that travels farther than the original site of violence. Bin Laden understood this well. The World Trade Center was not chosen by accident. It represented economic power, modern life, and global connection. The Pentagon represented military power. The attacks were designed not only to kill, but to send a message through images that would live for years. In that sense, the plot was not only violent, it was theatrical violence, calculated violence, violence designed for television, headlines, and history books. And yet, what it revealed most clearly was not genius, but moral collapse. To carry out such an attack, the planners and hijackers had to treat civilians as acceptable targets in a larger struggle. They had to reduce ordinary human life to symbolism. Once that happens, almost any cruelty becomes possible. That is why extremist thinking is so dangerous. It narrows the world into a simple moral map: us and them, purity and corruption, believers and enemies. Within that map, doubt becomes weakness, mercy becomes compromise, humanity becomes a problem. Bin Laden did not invent this pattern, but he used it with deadly skill. September 11th gave him the global shock he wanted, but it also brought down enormous force on him, on al-Qaeda, and on the Taliban government that had protected him. The question now was no longer only who had done this. The story was moving into a new phase, from planning to pursuit. The question was what the United States would do next. Chapter 9. War, Escape, and the Long Hunt. The United States demanded that the Taliban hand over Osama bin Laden. The Taliban refused. In October 2001, the United States and its allies began military action in Afghanistan. The immediate goals were clear: destroy al-Qaeda's safe haven, remove the Taliban from power, and break the network that had planned the attacks. At first, the campaign moved quickly. Taliban control weakened, al-Qaeda camps were hit, fighters fled, some were captured, others disappeared into mountains, villages, border regions, and hidden networks. Bin Laden himself escaped. That fact would matter for nearly another decade. By late 2001, he was believed to be in the Tora Bora region. There were battles, airstrikes, and searches, but he was not caught. This failure became one of the most significant missed opportunities of the early war. As long as he remained free, he was more than a fugitive. He was a symbol. His survival fed the myth that he was untouchable. It gave hope to followers and frustration to enemies. It allowed him to remain, in the imagination of extremists, a living challenge to the most powerful country on earth.
Meanwhile, the war in Afghanistan grew longer, harder, and more complex than many had first imagined. The simple language of the first weeks gave way to the difficult realities of insurgency, state building, corruption, and endless conflict. And September 11th continued to move through private life. There were funerals without bodies. There were photographs of the missing. There were children who grew up without one parent or both. There were first responders whose health would later be broken by toxic dust. There were marriages shattered by grief. There were people who looked normal from the outside and yet never felt fully safe again. This is part of what terrorism does. Its damage keeps moving through time. It does not stay where it first happened. It follows people home. It settles into memory. It returns on anniversaries. It changes the future of people who did not choose to be part of history. Bin Laden, during these years, released video and audio messages from hiding. In them, he tried to sound calm, confident, and patient. Even as a hunted man, he wanted to appear in control. The image mattered. Propaganda was central to his power. A single recording could threaten enemies, reassure followers, prove survival, and keep his myth alive. But his real life was much smaller than the myth. He could not move freely. He could not trust openly. He depended on couriers, private homes, and a small circle of loyal people. Power and fear were now tied together in the same life. The United States and its partners kept searching. They followed detainee reports, phone records, financial patterns, rumors, fragments, and names that often led nowhere. The work was patient, technical, and often invisible. This was not a movie-style hunt with constant breakthroughs. Most leads failed. Some were false. Some were incomplete. But over time, intelligence officers focused more and more on one basic truth. A man in deep hiding might never use a phone. He might not touch the internet. He might not appear in public. But someone still has to carry his messages. Find the courier, and you may find the man.
Chapter 10. Abbottabad. The hunt for Osama bin Laden eventually led to an unusual compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan. It was not what many people imagined. It was not a cave in a distant mountain. It was a walled compound in a city. That alone carried a strange irony. For years, the world's most wanted man had often been imagined as a ghost hiding at the edge of civilization. But the trail led somewhere much more ordinary in appearance and therefore, in some ways, more unsettling. The compound drew attention for several reasons. It had high walls. It had unusual privacy features. The people living there seemed careful about exposure. There was no clear digital life connected to the most suspicious figure inside. Investigators noticed patterns that suggested someone important was being protected. Still, certainty was difficult. They did not have a clean photograph proving bin Laden was there. They did not have a full confession. They had patterns, analysis, behavior, and probability. They had the shape of a truth, but not yet the final picture. American officials debated what to do. The decision carried great risk. If the intelligence was wrong, a raid could fail in dramatic fashion. If Pakistani forces reacted unexpectedly, an international crisis could follow. If bin Laden escaped again, the political and strategic damage would be enormous. President Obama approved the operation. On the night of May 1, 2011, according to U.S. time, American Special Operations Forces flew by helicopter into Abbottabad. In Pakistan, it was already early May 2.
The mission moved quickly. The helicopters arrived. The forces entered the compound. Rooms were cleared. People inside were confronted, and Osama bin Laden was found and killed during the raid. After nearly 10 years, the man who had become the face of September 11th was dead. The news spread around the world within hours. In the United States, crowds gathered in places like New York and Washington. Some people shouted, some cried, some felt relief more than joy. Some felt the moment as justice. Others felt only the strange stillness that comes when a long chapter finally ends. But for many families, it was not closure. Closure is often too simple a word. It did not bring the dead back. It did not erase trauma. It did not undo war. Still, it mattered. It marked an ending, and it revealed something important about bin Laden's final years. He had not been living as a romantic warrior, as some of his admirers imagined. He had been living a hidden, constrained life behind walls, dependent on secrecy and on the work of others. The myth was larger than the man, as myths often are. Chapter 11. The Man and the Myth. After the raid in Abbottabad, many people asked the same question again. Who was Osama bin Laden, really? Not the face on television, not the name in newspaper headlines, not the symbol. The man. By that point, the answer was clearer than ever. He was not a mystery. He was not a heroic rebel. He was not a voice for ordinary Muslims. He was a terrorist leader who had spent years using religion, anger, and politics to guide people toward violence. He knew how to take real pain and turn it into a weapon. He knew how to speak to people who felt humiliated, lost, or furious. He knew how to make murder sound like duty. That was one of his greatest dangers. He did not need to control millions of people. He only needed a small number of people who were ready to believe him completely. Bin Laden also understood something important about modern life. Modern cities run on trust. Air travel runs on trust. Office life runs on trust. Public life runs on trust. Most people leave home each morning without imagining that strangers are planning to turn ordinary systems into tools of mass death. Bin Laden understood that weakness. He looked at airplanes and saw weapons. He looked at tall buildings and saw targets. He looked at routine and saw an opening. That is part of why September 11th cut so deeply into public memory. It attacked not only people, but also the feeling that daily life was stable. But there is another lesson in his life. Simple stories can become deadly stories. Bin Laden offered a world that sounded easy to understand. In his version, there were the pure and the corrupt, the faithful and the enemy, honor and humiliation. Once a person accepted that map, mercy began to look like weakness, doubt began to look like betrayal, cruelty began to look righteous. That is how extremist thinking works. It makes the world smaller, then it makes violence easier. A passenger becomes only a symbol. A worker becomes only a target. A city becomes only a message. When that happens, ordinary human feeling starts to die long before the victim does. This is why stories about men like bin Laden have to be told carefully. There is always a temptation to make such figures seem larger than life, darker than ordinary people, almost mythic in their power. But that is exactly the wrong move. If we make him too large, we begin to help his legend survive. If we speak about him only as a man who changed history, we risk forgetting what kind of change he made. He did not build anything worth admiring. He built fear. He built grief. He built absence. He built years of funerals, hospitals, wars, and unanswered questions. That is the measure of his life, not greatness, damage.
Chapter 12. The Weight of the Story. When people talk about September 11th today, they often use very large words: history, war, terrorism, security. Those words are not wrong, but they can become so large that the human story starts to disappear inside them. And that would be a mistake. Because history is also a man standing in the street, staring at smoke and not yet knowing his wife is dead. It is a child being picked up from school while the adults try to stay calm. It is a voicemail that a family saves for years because it is the last voice they still have. It is a dinner table with one chair that no one can look at easily. It is a photograph in a drawer that hurts to touch. This is the weight of the story. Not only what happened in public, but what kept happening in private. The attacks were seen by the whole world, but grief was carried mostly in small rooms, in apartments, in kitchens, in hospital waiting rooms, in memorial services, in quiet moments when someone suddenly remembered what date it was. That is why September 11th stayed so alive in memory. It was not only a news event, it was a personal wound repeated thousands of times in thousands of homes. For some people, the hardest part was the waiting for a phone call, waiting for a name, waiting for a sign that someone might still be alive. Then later, waiting for remains to be identified, waiting for court cases, waiting for a feeling of peace that never fully came. And for many first responders, the suffering did not stop when the fires were out. They had gone into smoke, dust, and toxic air to help strangers. Years later, many of them became sick. Some lost their health slowly, some lost it fast. So the story of September 11th is also the story of people who survived the day but kept paying for it afterward. That is why this subject must be handled with care. If the story becomes too fascinated with the attacker, it becomes dishonest. If the victims fade into the background, the story becomes smaller than the truth. The truth is this: the dead were not scenery. The survivors were not side notes. They are at the center of what this attack really meant. Chapter 13. The Days After. Bin Laden would eventually be found and killed, but even that did not end the story, because the true size of an attack is measured not only in the moment of impact, but in the lives that remain broken afterward. When the towers fell, the story did not end. In many ways, it had only begun. For the families of the missing, the next hours and days were filled with uncertainty so painful that it hardly felt real. Some people still hoped. They called hospitals, they checked emergency lists, they sat in front of televisions for hours, they listened to messages again and again, they waited for a phone call that never came. Around New York, handmade posters began to appear on walls, windows, train stations, and street corners. Missing. Have you seen this person? Last seen in the North Tower. Last seen on the 102nd floor. Last called at 8:52.
The posters showed smiling faces from ordinary life, wedding photos, office photos, birthday photos, vacation photos. The faces looked warm, alive, familiar. They looked like people who should have come home before dinner. That was part of the cruelty. The city was full of proof that these people had existed, and full of silence where they should have been. At Ground Zero, rescue and recovery workers searched through smoke, twisted steel, ash, and poisonous dust. In the first days, some still hoped they might find survivors in hidden spaces. Then the hope became thinner, then thinner still. But the work went on. Firefighters searched for firefighters, police officers searched for police officers, brothers searched for brothers, friends searched for names they were afraid to hear. Some remains were found, many were not. That made grief even harder. Without a body, the mind keeps resisting the truth. Part of the heart keeps saying maybe, even when the world is already saying no. And the aftermath kept spreading. A man went home and had to explain death to a child. A woman opened a closet and found shirts that would never be worn again. Parents waited for footsteps that never came. Children learned what mourning looked like from the faces of adults around them. This is why September 11th remained more than a public tragedy. It became a private one, again and again, inside ordinary homes. For first responders, the aftermath carried another burden. Many survived the day itself, only to face serious illness later. The air around Ground Zero carried dangerous dust and chemicals. Men and women who rushed in to help often paid again through sickness, surgeries, treatment, and shortened lives. So when we speak about the victims of September 11th, we have to speak widely. Not only of those who died that morning, but also of those whose bodies broke later, those whose families were changed forever, those who never felt fully safe again. This wider circle of suffering is part of the truth, and it is part of what bin Laden's violence really did. He did not only attack buildings, he attacked memory, he attacked routine, he attacked the future people thought they were going to have. Chapter 14. The World That Followed. September 11th changed more than one city and more than one country. It changed the mood of an era. It changed the habits of travel. It changed the language of politics. It changed the way many people thought about danger. Before 2001, many younger people today would hardly recognize the feel of air travel. Security was lighter. People moved through airports differently. The idea of passenger planes being turned into weapons was not at the center of public fear. After September 11th, that changed at once. But the deeper changes went far beyond airports. The United States launched a broad campaign against terrorism. Intelligence work expanded, military operations widened, governments shared more information, new laws appeared, new arguments about safety and freedom entered public life. Some people believed these changes were necessary. Others feared the price would be too high. Often, both feelings existed together. That is why the story of bin Laden cannot be told only as the story of one man being hunted. The attacks helped shape a whole period of public life. Wars grew. Fear grew. Suspicion grew. Political language hardened. One painful result was the rise of anti-Muslim suspicion in many places. Ordinary Muslims who had nothing to do with al-Qaeda and often rejected it completely were sometimes treated as if they carried blame. Mosques were threatened. Families felt watched. Public speech became harsher. That too belongs in the story. Extremism does not only kill, it also spreads distrust. It damages the space between people. It makes neighbors look at one another with fear. Bin Laden wanted that kind of division. He wanted the world to split into hard camps. He wanted anger to grow on every side. He wanted people to stop seeing one another clearly. History shows what happens when that desire spreads. The years after September 11th also included the invasion of Iraq in 2003. That war was not a simple direct act of bin Laden, but it grew inside the atmosphere created by the attacks: fear, urgency, anger, and a belief that the next blow might already be coming. The region changed again. Violence spread in new ways. Later extremist groups grew out of later chaos. This does not reduce bin Laden's guilt. The attacks were his crime. But one act of terror can create many later decisions, and those decisions can produce new suffering of their own. That is why September 11th still feels close, even after all these years. Its consequences did not remain in the past. They moved into law, policy, memory, culture, and daily habit. A whole generation grew up inside the world that followed. For many of them, permanent alert felt normal because they inherited a time shaped by terror.
Chapter 15: Why Men Like Bin Laden Matter to Study. There is a simple way to talk about men like bin Laden. Call them monsters and stop there. The feeling behind that response is understandable. He helped organize mass murder. Moral judgment is necessary. But if we stop there, we learn too little. We still need to ask the harder questions. What did he offer people? Why did some follow him? Why did his words feel powerful to them? Part of the answer is that he offered a full explanation of the world. People often want that. They want life to make sense. They want suffering to have a clear cause. They want someone to name the enemy and draw the map. Bin Laden did exactly that. He told followers that they were living in a time of humiliation and betrayal. He told them ordinary politics was useless. He told them violence could restore meaning. He told them death in the cause was proof of honor, not a tragedy. For some people, especially people carrying anger, shame, confusion, loneliness, or wounded pride, that message can feel powerful. It turns uncertainty into certainty. It turns frustration into mission. It turns private disappointment into a grand role in history. That pattern matters far beyond this one story. It appears in many extremist movements. First, a person feels unseen or humiliated. Then a movement offers belonging. Then the movement offers a simple story. Then the story creates enemies. Then cruelty becomes easier. Then violence enters. This is why the study of extremism has to be serious and careful, not fascinated, not romantic, serious. We need to understand how propaganda works, how groups create loyalty, how wounded pride can be used, how leaders use repetition, fear, and certainty, how they make followers feel chosen, how they slowly train people to stop seeing the humanity of others. Bin Laden was effective not because he was magical, but because he understood a few deep human weaknesses: the desire to belong, the desire to feel pure, the desire to blame someone, the escape from complexity. Extremists promise a clean world, but the clean world they promise is always built on blood. That is why stories like this must be told with care, especially for listeners who are still learning English. If the language becomes too abstract, the lesson becomes weak. If the tone becomes too fascinated, the moral center becomes weak. And if the script becomes only a list of dates and facts, the emotional truth becomes weak. The storyteller has to do something difficult: tell the truth clearly, keep the victims visible, Explain the danger without feeding the myth. That is the only responsible way to tell a story like this one.
Chapter 16. What Must Be Remembered. In the end, Osama bin Laden did change history. That much is true. He helped plan an attack that shocked the world and pushed many countries into a new era of fear, war, and security politics. But he did not build anything worthy. He did not create justice. He did not create dignity. He did not create freedom. He created grief. He created widows and widowers. He created children who grew up with one voice missing from the house. He created anniversaries that people still approach with a tight chest and a quiet face. He created a wound that still speaks more than 20 years later. That is the real measure of his life. Not greatness, damage. Not destiny, destruction. When we study him, we should do so without illusion. He was not a liberator. He was not a heroic rebel. He was not the voice of the weak. He was a terrorist leader who helped organize one of the worst attacks on civilians in modern history. And when we remember the people harmed by his choices, we should remember their humanity first. The worker pouring morning coffee, the passenger fastening a seatbelt, the firefighter climbing one more staircase, the police officer entering smoke, the husband waiting for a call, the child waiting at home. These people are not footnotes to the story. They are the story. That is the final discipline this subject asks of us. Look clearly at the man behind the crime, but do not let him become larger than the lives he destroyed. Remember the attack, remember the fear, remember the courage, remember the cost, and remember that any ideology which teaches people to stop seeing the humanity of others is already pointing toward darkness. If we keep that lesson, then the story remains useful, not because it gives us comfort, but because it gives us clarity. And clarity is one of the few honest things history can offer. Epilogue. The Long Echo. At this point, the facts of the story are behind us. What remains is the echo. More than 2 decades have passed since September 11th, 2001, and yet the day is not really over. It continues in memory. It continues in policy. It continues in the way people talk about safety, borders, religion, war, and fear. It continues in the private calendars of families who still stop and go quiet when the date returns. That is one reason the story of Osama bin Laden remains important, not because he deserves attention for his own sake, but because the damage he helped cause still moves through the world. There are adults now who were children when the attacks happened. There are adults who were not even born yet, and still they live in systems shaped by that morning. They walk through airports designed by its memory. They inherit laws shaped by its fear. They learn history in the shadow of wars that followed from it. This is what it means for an event to outlive itself. It becomes part of ordinary life, and ordinary life is exactly what bin Laden tried to wound. He did not only want to kill, he wanted normal life to feel fragile. He wanted people to see danger inside familiar systems. He wanted routine to feel unsafe. He wanted trust to weaken. In some ways, he succeeded, but not in every way. Cities kept living. Families kept rebuilding. People still boarded planes. Workers still returned to offices. Children still grew into adults. The world changed, but it did not freeze forever inside his vision of fear. That matters, because evil often wants to become permanent in memory. It wants to define the whole age. It wants to become the first and last thing people remember. And yet, human life pushes back, not always loudly, often quietly. Quietly, people go on. Quietly, they mourn. Quietly, they rebuild schools, marriages, neighborhoods, and routines. Quietly, they choose not to let terror become the whole meaning of their lives. That may be the deepest answer to a man like bin Laden, not forgetfulness, not carelessness, but clear memory without surrender. Remember what happened. Remember who did it. Remember the cost. Remember the warning signs, and then refuse to let murder define the meaning of the living. This is also why the victims must remain visible, not only in memorials, ceremonies, or official speeches, but in the imagination of anyone telling the story. The dead of September 11th were not side characters in the biography of a terrorist. They were human beings whose own lives mattered completely. One of them might have been planning dinner. One of them might have been worrying about rent. One of them might have been expecting a baby. One of them might have been late for a meeting. One of them might have been thinking about nothing larger than the next 10 minutes. And then history arrived in the form of men who had convinced themselves that innocent people were acceptable tools. That is why any serious account of bin Laden must finally return to one simple moral line. No grievance, however real, gives moral permission to murder civilians. No ideology, however certain it sounds, can make such murder noble. No political anger can wash blood clean. Bin Laden built his life around the opposite claim. That is why his life ended where it did, in hiding, behind walls, protected by secrecy, remembered not for justice, but for slaughter. And that is why the final lesson of this story should remain plain. Extremism often begins by promising clarity, but the clarity it offers is false. It removes complexity by removing humanity. It makes violence seem pure by refusing to look at the people who suffer. The answer to that false clarity is not confusion. It is honest clarity, the clarity that keeps human beings visible, the clarity that says the victims matter more than the myth, the clarity that refuses to call destruction greatness. If we keep that clarity, then this story remains more than a tragedy remembered. It becomes a warning. And warnings, when we listen to them carefully, are one of the few gifts the past can still give the future. This was the story of Osama bin Laden, the man behind September 11th.